Hi, a very warm welcome from me. I'm Richard Reeves, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, which you can see at least virtually behind me, and a very warm welcome to our guest today, Matthew Yglesias. We're here to talk about Matthew's new book, 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. And we're going to dive into that shortly. Also inviting you to throw your questions in, use the hashtag 1 Billion Americans or events at Brookings.edu. We want to hear your questions. I'm going to kind of dive in just a moment. But first of all, a warm welcome to you as well, Matthew. Congratulations on your book. Tell us, before we get into the substance, what is it like to do a book tour from your basement?
It's a little bit different. I was really looking forward to, visiting some different cities, seeing, my favorite independent bookstores, lining up, different friends of mine, different places. The nice thing about the virtual book tour is that I have been able to do a lot more, right? It's much more sort of time efficient. So I've been able to talk to a lot of people, be on a ton of podcasts, a lot of different radio stations around the country. So, that's interesting. I think like most people, I kind of miss getting out and about.
Yeah, there's got to be a midpoint, right? There has to be a happy medium.
But, I mean, it'll be interesting going forward, right? What of the sort of do everything on Zoom landscape actually sticks with us, because it does have some real advantages, in terms of efficiency and things like that.
Which planes do you get on and which ones do you think
exactly
maybe I can do that one right?
But I'm sick of it at this point. All I want to do is shake people's hands.
Yeah, I get it. I'm with you. So also just congratulations. The book is getting a lot of attention against some pretty serious headwinds, given that there are a few other things going on, and you obviously knew that going into it. Lots of attention, lots of reviews. Podcast seems to be doing very well, and in fact, kind of at least one of the people blurbing it. So I should introduce you properly. Normally people say you don't need any introduction, at least in the Wonka sphere. Matt,
sure.
You probably don't, but co-founder of Vox and host of The Weeds, just a fabulous policy podcast, and you've had some of our Brookings colleagues on there and so on. So and actually one of the blurbers of the book says it's the genius of the book, and says it's bracing and ambitious. But that's Ezra Klein, who is one of the other co-founders of Vox. So well chosen. But one of the things I want to say, and we'll dig into this, coming at this myself as kind of a new American, is that the central thesis of the book is, I want to start there, because it's a sort of intrinsically expansive, growth-based, bigger is better view, right? It's just that America is a kind of an idea of expansion, right? It's a kind of grow or die sense. It's almost like a young country, not as a metaphor, but actually just real, not settling down, ready to kind of move and grow. And so, which I think is against a lot of the pessimism you see on left and right now. So there is this, I appreciated that, because I think that kind of expansiveness, grow or die thing, it does feel to me that that's intrinsically American. So there's two questions, right? One is that right? Do you think that that's always been in the kind of American DNA, that idea of growth, movement, expansion? And then secondly, say a little bit more about why bigger is better, because there's any number of reasons. It could be militarily, economically, etc. And then we'll kind of respond. But is that right? Are we inescapably expansionist in this country? We've got to get bigger?
Well, I think that at our best, we sort of have been, right? That we have been a country that is based on a charter of ideas, right? And a country that, from 13 colonies from sea to shining sea. And that is very much welded into the American idea, right? So it's been a diverse country from the get-go. I mean, we look back at, sort of colonial America, and we say, well, that was actually quite homogenous place, but they felt it was diverse at the time, Episcopalians and Congregationalists and Quakers and Catholics. And they said, okay, well, we are going to write down on a piece of paper sort of founding principles. And that's what America is. And other people could come here and be Americans by signing on to those principles, and other places could become America, right? And we talk now sometimes about Puerto Rico, but colonization has been very marginal to American history, right? We instead incorporate places and we incorporate people into this set of ideas, and it's how we became a pretty large country in the scheme of things.
Just growing west.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, like all these people came here, and we went all the way to the west, and that's been an important theme throughout our history. And I also think, I mean, as long as I'm here with you, one sort of thought about dream hoarders is, well, like, do we have a finite quantity of American dream? that then has to be like hoarded or redistributed, or can America be more, right? Because a lot of what we do in our politics these days is sort of fight over quasi-fixed pies. But, you know, one of the big ideas of this book is try to think more expansively, try to think less inwardly, but in terms of our role in the world and in terms of other countries. So, you know, bigger is better, I think, along a number of dimensions, but the kind of prime one, the main sort of frame of the book, is that the United States has been the world's leading economy, leading military power for a bit over 100 years now, for as long as anyone is alive, in effect. And we are in a position where that is now at risk, and people are aware that it's at risk. There's a lot of sort of discourse about China in security circles, a lot of anxiety in our trade policy. But I'm argue that, you know, we should focus on the fundamentals there, that we can't stop China from trying to become a wealthier country. We probably shouldn't. Like, even if we could,
even morally, that would be wrong. Even
right. I mean, there's a lot of alarming aspects to the rise of China, but also a lot of good ones. But anyway, we can't. So it doesn't matter. But we do control our own destiny, right? The United States has been on a different historical trajectory from Canada since our inception. And it's because America's founders have wanted to be a sort of a great nation, right? Not a nice place off in the corner, but a shining city on a hill that does things in the world. And we can do that again. We can be deliberate about that and try to both do more to support, you know, having families and children here, and be more open to sort of recruitment from the world around us, and that will have, you know, important internal but also external benefits.
Do you worry that this idea of greatness, of American greatness, which I think is tied to this idea of growth and so on, has been somewhat tarnished now, not least by Donald Trump making America great as his slogan, and a lot of those on the left would say actually this kind of tendency towards imperialism and growth is kind of destroying the planet, and why do we have to be number one? And that's a problem. And I think you're probably getting some of that heat from the left. It looks like as if this basic premise that we should be great, we should seek to be number one, top dog, as you kind of put it, that's just wrong. Like, why? And it's actually a fundamentally conservative, or even, in other words, like if Trump hadn't used it, you could have called your book, like, Make America Great Again, or Keep America Great. Talk about this idea of greatness and how that's being politicized.
Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't have written the book if not for Trump and that slogan, because Trump got me thinking about this subject. You know, I think like most people in America, I kind of took for granted to some extent, like America's leading position in the world. And Trump put this theme on the table in a big way, and also in a very specific way, right? So I did an interview. It was concurrent with the book coming out, but separate, with Veronica Escobar, member of Congress from El Paso. And she said, you know, I see that slogan, and to me, that just means like he wants to make America white again, she said. And, you know, I think that's true on one level, right? I mean, this is a lot of his great again, right? He means
the again
very much.
Yeah.
It's like, let's go back to how things were in the past. And I don't think that's right. You know, I mean, you can think about it in racial terms, or if you don't, nostalgia just doesn't get you anywhere as a political program. Make things the way they were decades ago. Like, that's not realistic. But the idea that America should be great, should aspire to greatness, you know, that resonates with a lot of people. And I think for good reason. And I do think that there is on the left, not just as a backlash to Trump, but a kind of a politics of anti-patriotism that I think is sort of a conceptual and political dead end. And also, I think, wrong on the merits. I mean, there are a lot of small countries, you know, that are not, quote unquote, great, that are nonetheless great places to live. Right? There's nothing wrong with Denmark or Finland or Canada or New Zealand, but they are on some level free riding on the existence of a international order that's dominated by liberal powers. And they have avoided, I mean, America has not always used its power responsibly in an international arena. And I think it's a great privilege in some ways to get to be Denmark and look around and be like, hey, like there's no Vietnam War, there's no Iraq in our history, but at the same time, we do things to establish a military and economic climate, and not alone. I mean, often in partnership with the UK, to a lesser extent France, but like bigger countries that have a larger military tradition are doing things that the sort of smaller, more quiescent liberal powers take advantage of. And the whole world, or all the liberal elements of the world, would regret it if the torch of international hegemony was passed to China. It would have a negative impact on Americans, but also on Canadians and
Right.
people all around the world.
Well, I wanted to ask about that because you have a background in thinking about geopolitics and foreign relations, and try and get to the bottom of the extent to which this is a geopolitical argument as much as an economic argument or social welfare argument, more domestically. Which is, how different would your argument be if it wasn't China that was challenging for the top dog? I'm thinking, of course, part of my own background is maybe one of the reasons it was easier for Britain to sort of see its own empire being eclipsed by the American empire was because, liberal democracy is kind of similar. Even in that case, spoke the same language, and so although one empire waned, another rose. That was within the context of broadly shared liberal foundations. And so would the book be different if, let's imagine it was the UK? Let's have fun. Or is it how China specific is your concern that the US remains number one?
I mean, it would be a very different book if not for that. I mean, the domestic analysis, it all holds up. But so there's a journalist I love, Doug Saunders. He wrote a book called Maximum Canada. And it has a similar thesis. It calls for a tripling of the Canadian population. But it obviously doesn't have that geopolitical hook to it at all. It's purely an argument about the economic benefits of population growth in the context of a sparsely populated, English-speaking liberal settler state. So I think the facts carry over, but to me it changes. It's relevant, because if we were talking about ceding hegemony to Finland, who cares, right? On some level. And I think it matters for the politics, though, because we obviously have significant tensions in this country about cultural change, right? There are people who don't like the fact that the ethnic balance and the cultural balance in the country is shifting. And it is difficult to, in some definitive way, say that that is wrong or that is mistaken. And if you look at certain countries, right, like the purpose of Finland is to be a land for Finns. And if people there want to say, well, too many people who aren't Finnish and like it's not a land of Finns anymore, I don't know. I mean, not every Finnish person finds that compelling, but it makes a certain amount of sense. I'm Jewish. There is a country that purports to be like the state for Jews, and obviously that very heavily shapes their immigration policy and many other things. But the United States is not like that, right? That is not our founding principle. This is not a country for white people or a country for Christian people. It's a country dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Right.
And that means something, right? And so I think that you gain traction outside of the narrowly economic, neoliberal sphere by appealing to the geopolitical interests, the cultural and ideological foundations of the country in a way that is important, which is to say, like, factually, Donald Trump is not making America great again with his policy approach. Like, he is making us a smaller country, like in a literal sense, as well as a conceptual one. And if you continue on the trajectory that he has us on of fewer legal immigrants, also fewer unauthorized immigrants, also a less generous welfare state, a lot of tweets about how we have to uphold single family zoning, like all this stuff, like we are going to become a lesser country, like in a literal sense, not just in a this is not who we are kind of sense, but like more people and urban growth is like the only way that America can continue to be sort of number one.
Well, let's switch. Let's move on to this question of immigration, which actually even some of the questions that are flying in right now get at this this question of immigration. So you describe, more people. So there's this moreness, as I said at the beginning, to it, which and a big part of that, obviously, in the title of the book, which we've used as a kind of organizing frame of a billion, is more people. And you describe the easy way to get more people as through immigration. And we'll perhaps come back to the harder way of doing it, which is through increasing fertility in a moment. But like the easy way to get more people is just to let more people in. And I'd just like you to talk a bit more about what you mean by better immigrants, and in a couple of ways. One is this whole merit-based argument. And so you very strongly criticize the cotton raise approach because it wouldn't let in Kazuo Ishiguro, which was a great example. And just it's too narrowly, it's too constricted. But you do see, the idea of better going forward anyway appeals to you, and particularly this issue of better in terms of fit with the culture. So you just said we're not like Finland or Israel, right? We're not for Finns or Jews, etc. But we're also not like that entirely, right? And so I'm just going to get the sense in which we're not intrigues me. And I know that on one of the podcasts you did, I think it may have been with Ben Shapiro, you got into a discussion about Syrian Christians and language. And so what extent does a better immigrant mean the skill stuff, which I hear a bit about that, but secondly, to what extent is it legitimate to consider things like cultural fit to the ideals of America, or language or religion and so on? So tackle that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, when I say better, I meant pretty narrowly the skill focus. Obviously, there's nothing better about being a native English speaker versus Swahili or anything
Christian,
else.
But Christian versus Jewish or anything at all.
Right, and I mean, I'm Jewish, so I'm not going to say
you're not arguing for a Christianization.
There's something better about Christian people. Right. What I am saying is that I think immigration is so good that it behooves people who like immigration to bend a little to the preferences of people who are skeptical about it, and to listen to what they are saying and try to make a deal, to the extent that you can, right? So, what I was saying on, I think it was Shapiro's show, right? There was this situation around refugees from Syria where Republicans, they really didn't want to let any Syrian refugees in. Right. And then some US leaders, I think Arab Christian leaders, were pointing out that a lot of the people fleeing the conflict were themselves Christians. And, this was very sad. And Ted Cruz kind of floated the idea well, maybe we should let Syrian Christians in as refugees. And in America, just the kind of bureaucratic inertia was no, well, we can't do that, right? It would be discriminatory. And, okay, I mean, it would be, but compromising on just leveling down and letting no refugees in.
There's none. If the counterfactual is none.
Right.
Then...
Whereas, I mean, so we treat people fleeing Cuba differently from people fleeing any other country on earth. And there's no good reason for that, right? It is not logically defensible. But to level down and say, well, we need to treat people leaving Cuba as stingily as we treat people leaving every other country, that to me doesn't make sense. If an ethnic lobby inside the Republican Party wants to argue for generous treatment of Cubans, and I, as a cosmopolitan person, want to argue for generous treatment of everybody, then that's okay. We should, and actually, I should say the Obama administration near the end of their term, they did actually clamp down somewhat on people leaving Cuba, seemingly, I think, in an effort to mess with Donald Trump, make problems for him. And it hasn't worked as a political gambit. South Florida Cuban population remains heavily Republican. Trump has not relifted those restrictions, and it's just sad. We have thousands of people who under the old rules would be in here now who are not, as a result of a mix between Obama era shifts and Trump era shifts in asylum policy, and that's just bad, right? So I think if we want to have special preference for English speakers, if we want to have special preference for people from certain parts of the world, that's okay. I also do think realistically, it still would mean in practice probably taking a lot of people from Africa or people from the Afro-Caribbean. That's where English-speaking Christians who want to move to the United States live. Trump says, well, he wants Norwegians, which is that's a hard one.
It's very specific. It's a very specific immigration policy.
I mean, Norway's a very wealthy country with a very small population.
Right.
That being said, you could even make a deal on that. Like years ago, I had an intern from Norway. She was on one of those practical training visas that you get after your student visa. Then she had to go back to Norway because it's just hard to immigrate to the United States no matter what. And Trump has made it harder to stay on those practical training things. He didn't lobby for a Norway extension. So that would be dumb. Obviously, a special Norwegians only immigration provision, but I wouldn't say no to it.
Right. So it feels to me that this is a deal you're trying to strike here. Right now, there's this kind of immigration bad view, and then you use a merit-based system almost as an anti-immigration policy. Actually, I mean, that's kind of what's happening on some people on the right, and then all immigration good, any kind of selectivity, any sense that there's better or worse is just unacceptable. And it seems like you're just willing to do a kind of deal, which is, look, if there's a bit of anxiety, and there's some arguments for sort of making sure there's at least some fit, if what I get for that is I get to let a whole bunch more people in, I will take that deal, and that politically has more chance of being lifted up than an approach to just anybody can come in up to a certain level, right?
Right. Well, and particularly because, at the extremes, right? So immigrants from the Indian subcontinent have been very successful in the United States, a great asset to our society here. It's clearly true that if that's a lot of people live in India, if 700 million people from India arrived tomorrow, that would be very disruptive, like on any number of different levels. So I don't like worry about that happening because the political constraints bite so much sooner than that. But yeah, I mean, I want to say that like immigration is good. And if people really have specific objections, we should try to work with that and go for it, because so much of what's actually happening is, so Cotton has this bill. He says, okay, well, we should let people in with skills. Say, okay. And then he says, okay, and we should also cut the number of people who come in half. And we should give you extra points for winning Olympic medals, but not in team sports, and for winning a Nobel Prize, but not in literature. And it's like, well, what's going on here? This is like a level of paranoia about foreigners that makes no sense.
And it gets smaller rather than bigger. Well, let's turn to the hard way of getting more people, which is to increase the fertility rate, more children. And let's talk about what I would see as your kind of progressive pronatalism. And there's lots in there. Certainly there's lots of things which people on the left would like, universal child allowances, paid leave, etc., to try and reduce the opportunity cost, especially of parenting. So there's the cost, of course, but I think you acknowledge that it's much more about the opportunity cost, especially as women's wages and employment levels have gone up. In fact, in recent work, we show that middle-class American families would have seen no increase in income at all since 1980, had it not been for the increase in women's work, especially mothers' work. So actually, there was one point I did disagree in the book, I have to say, just on a personal level. At one point in the book, you do this for good economic reasons, you say that parenting is like playing in a string quartet. Yeah, and I can tell you, I've had 3 kids and I've played in a string quartet. It's nothing like it. It's that there is trust me, there is no similarity whatsoever between sitting down with 3 adults playing a string quartet. But your point was about labor intensity. So talk a bit more about how hard that actually, right? Because it seems to me that the issues around religiosity and culture and so on, those are huge, about what it means to be a progressive pronatalist, because you're running into a lot of wins there. One is the women's movement has, to a very large extent, rested on fewer children, not more. And that meant more economic power for women. And that probably remains the case even in a country as far as the US. So talk a bit more about kind of why you've ended up in this unusual pronatalist position, I think, given that you're coming at it from a more progressive stance.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the idea, okay, well, we should have paid parental leave or we should have preschool programs. Those are not unfamiliar progressive ideas or feminist ideas, right? I mean, if you look at particularly in Democratic Party politics, those are normally coded as sort of women's topics. And it's the women senators who sort of wrote the Parental Leave Act, even though it's a gender neutral concept. It is factually true, as far as I could tell from academic research, that if you did these things the Democrats want, people would have more children. but Democrats don't like to talk about that. Then conversely, the people who are most interested in having more children are conservative people, and they don't like the idea of spending money on stuff. So they look at this exact same literature and they see that, well, the increase in the number of children people have is modest. And so in their mind, if you love babies and you hate the welfare state, you say, okay, well, this doesn't work, right? And a lot of conservatives say that. They say, oh, they tried this and it doesn't work. If you look at it though, like it does work. It's just, it costs a lot of money and the change in fertility is modest.
Yes.
But if you like those programs, as progressive people do, like this is a real impact that exists there. It is not the case. The typical American family is not composed of an incredibly ambitious, incredibly successful political pro who like all they want to do is shatter glass ceilings. Like people have jobs. They're working to live, not living to work. If you made it a little less financially burdensome to have children, they would have more. It's clear in surveys, it's clear in the cross-national data, it's clear in time series from when these things are rolled out. And what's true though is that the impact is not huge. Like if you thought these were all terrible ideas, like the extra babies alone would not suddenly turn them into compelling ideas.
Right. But you think they're good ideas anyway, because they support working families and we have many more dual learner couples and so on. So if you did all these things and it turned out that it only moved the fertility rate a little bit, which I think my reading of the evidence, and I won't claim to be an expert on that particular field, is that it's pretty, you don't get that much movement, even when you throw a lot of public policy at it, if you go down that route. You get some, but I get the sense that, you would have put the same policies into a book about helping families to make more money, more economic security. So you don't need the pronatal argument to argue for those policies. You want them anyway. You just think that's maybe a bonus. Is that fair?
It's a question of prioritization, right? There's a lot of things that from a sort of economic equality standpoint, I might say are good ideas to do, right? And if I didn't care at all about population growth, things like that, I think what I would say is probably that sectoral bargaining, right? That things in the labor market structure are more powerful levers for egalitarianism than this welfare state stuff. The reason I have a book that promotes one set of ideas is that I have come to think that the impact on fertility and on long-term population trends and on geopolitics is in fact very important. So,
right. And
then I was on Tyler Cohen's show and he said like, well, isn't the real answer here to make people more religious?
Yeah.
Which obviously it is on one level, but that's
it's really hard to find. It's really hard to find a public policy for that.
Right. I mean, I don't know of any policy lever that's going to just like make people go be Mormons. It would actually improve a lot of things in American society if everyone became church-going Mormons, as far as because you would drink less, right? And alcohol abuse is a huge social.
There's a whole number of things, but just because something's good doesn't mean that there's a good public policy to promote that thing. But there is also another issue here, which is, it's kind of icky territory, and I commend you for going into it for that reason. It's much easier not to, because there has, and I think you mentioned this in the book, there's this actually a kind of pronatal policy has been really, I think, infected, I think it's the right word, this kind of great replacement stuff with this about, whites, white supremacists saying, all these other people are outbreeding us, we've got to have more white kids. But of course, given the age distribution of the US and given what you're likely to see in terms of immigration, any successful pronatalist policy is going to result in more Black children and immigrant children and Hispanic children. And so it will accelerate the diversification of the US. Is that A, empirically true, and B, something that you just think is something we should be celebrating? Because there's this kind of weird sort of odd politics of pronatal policy.
Yeah, I don't think we should be trying to manipulate the ethnic balance of the country at all.
No.
Particularly,
I'm saying it's a result.
But yes. I mean, there is a theme. The great replacement is the idea that liberals are trying to we're moving in immigrants because white people aren't having babies anymore. And so consequently, there are some people on the left who view any discussion of this topic as inherently tied to that kind of white nationalist politics. Factually, right? Unless the program was specifically targeted to only give benefits to white people, the population of 20 20-somethings, which is where the leverage
where the babies
is.
are born. Yeah.
Right. That is a much less white group of people than the country as a whole. And the decline in the number of children being had is actually was much larger in the African American population, because I mean we actually did the opposite of this in the 90s welfare reform, is we sort of tried to micro target Black mothers and get them to have fewer children, and successfully, but I think in a not great way. And then also, immigrants themselves have children, right? So there's a complicated interplay of these two kinds of things. But I think basically you would be accelerating the diversification of the country, simply because the childbearing population is more diverse.
It seems unavoidable, although not stated. So we have actually some questions coming in which relate to something I was going to move on to, which is the issue of density. So I'll frame this first of all, because at parts of the book, it felt to me you were arguing almost as much for a denser America as for a bigger America. And of course, denser sort of means smaller. You make the point that we're getting smaller economically, right? We are getting more economically concentrated. So we're sort of big, but shrinking in an economic sense. But you make a strong argument for density, more innovation, more productivity. It's actually better for the climate, etc. So there's a very strong kind of urban argument running through this. You then say that has spillover effects for small towns and rural area, and they're kind of in this reciprocal economic relationship. And then you have some ideas about how to regenerate the heartland, which we can maybe get to. But would it be fair to say that this is as much an argument for a more urban and denser America as it is for a bigger America? And what's the relationship between those two?
Right. Well, I mean, the United States is large. We have we're the third largest population already, because we have, I believe, the third largest land area. But we're much more densely populated than Russia or China, less dense than China or India. So it's an argument that we should be bigger, that we should be larger. But then a lot of people see the downside as, well, to be larger, we would have to be denser, and that would be bad. So I think it's important to take people through both the fact that the United States is really not dense. I mean, my sort of headline fact I would like people to learn from this book is that 1 billion Americans would be as dense as France.
It's a great fact.
Half as dense as Germany.
It's a great
still nothing compared to, I take it you're from England, which the UK is much denser than triple the United States, and that's because nobody lives in Scotland. So like actual England is,
well, I have some Scottish relatives, but you're right. But the whole west coast of Scotland, like, it feels crowded in the cities, but it doesn't feel crowded in North Wales or west of Scotland.
Exactly. And so the way modern people exist, right? You have this phenomenon that, like, cities are crowded. Right. London is crowded. Glasgow is crowded, even though it's not that big a city. And then you can have huge empty spaces, even in sparsely populated countries. But so then the question becomes, like, are cities sites of immiseration? In which case we might really worry about density, or are they good? And they're good. Like, cities, it's not that everybody has to live in a city. There's nothing wrong with being a farmer or living in the country, but prosperity is driven largely by urbanization and sort of urban concentrations. So there's reason to believe that a denser, larger America would also be a wealthier America.
Yeah, and there's this question about NIMBYism and what that means. To say that the return, you think you cite Ricardo, the return of kind of land scarcity. And it's a shame that Henry George was more popular in Europe than in the US, but that's a whole different conversation, which we need Jenny Schutz for, who I know you've had on your show.
Yes.
And you actually referred to Jenny's work on kind of gentle density. So that's relevant to this question. We've got a few, actually, Evan and a few others, about this problem of NIMBYism. So you talk about the asymmetry here, the political asymmetry. The people who are defending the status quo know who they are and know where they live. The people who might benefit from somewhat less regulated land use don't know who they are yet, and so don't show up. So it's really hard to organize YIMBYs because they don't know who they are yet. And you talk quite a lot about that, and you talk about the need for a broad brush approach, none of this kind of Big Bang Warren style stuff. And I think a lot of that makes a lot of sense. But then you say, well, the action here has to be at the state level. And I agree with that. And I think most of my colleagues would, that states are really starting to move on this. But thus far, the states haven't had that much success in terms of actually enacting this legislation against the forces of NIMBYism. And that's one of the questions we kind of had here. Talk a bit more about how you see the politics of density more broadly and of NIMBY versus YIMBY. I'm sorry to simplify it.
Yeah.
playing
Well,
out, because it's not work. It hasn't happened in Massachusetts or California or New York yet. And those are the kind of places where you hope it would have happened, right?
Well, I mean, I think whether or not you think state level zoning reform has been successful depends somewhat on your baseline expectations. And one thing that I've learned about American politics over the years is that the right baseline is nothing will happen. It's very challenging to make legislative changes in the United States. So in California earlier this term, we had a bill that would have substantially increased density. It passed the state Senate and it passed the state assembly. Yet through
we all got very excited. This is Scott Wiener's bill, right?
Yes. Through some piece of mystical process, it didn't go to the governor's desk because it wasn't passed in the right timing, because the state Senate president and the assembly president were mad at each other about an unrelated issue. So that's not great. Like I am sad that that happened. At the same time, I think it's an existence proof that the politics of this are doable, right? There are things you can't do, right? There are things that don't get on the agenda, or that, you know, if you put them on the agenda, they get no support. But California has passed several waves of accessory dwelling unit reform. That's good. It's passed a few things targeted on affordable housing. That's good. Both Washington and Oregon have passed statewide sort of zoning reform things. On the East Coast, we've done nothing. East Coast states have done absolutely nothing useful.
Yeah, there was a bill in Massachusetts, I think, that didn't go anywhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've been introduced. You know, I mean, a friend of mine in the Maryland legislature has a good bill. There's a bill in the Virginia legislature. But those are, if the best example I had was the East Coast bills, you'd say, okay, this doesn't work. The fact that in the West Coast, they're up there, right? It does say to me that, like, political leadership counts for something, right? Like, you could, Andrew Cuomo was a pretty good governor, I think, in many ways. Certainly not averse to the idea of like centralizing power or trying to do big things, but like he is not interested in housing as a topic, right? He governs the state that is probably most crippled by NIMBY regulations. You even just compare the New Jersey suburbs of New York City to the ones in New York, and like the New York NIMBY situation is catastrophic. And you need an elected official there to say he wants to take this problem on. You know, Massachusetts too. I mean, I talk to people, Democrats there, who sit around and they're very frustrated because Charlie Baker has like a 90% approval rating or something. And I said, I was like, well, why don't you propose like actually trying to solve one of your state's big problems? Like, that might be interesting to people. And they're like, oh, no. You know, like the voters won't like that. And I'm like, well, like what you're doing now, like you're getting beaten like really badly in this blue state by a Republican governor who is like a nice, calm guy, but he stands for the status quo. So it's like, what? Try to change something. Like,
and you actually
some imagination.
So it does require, because otherwise, if you leave it at a local level, the asymmetries will come back in. It does lead to. We've had a few questions about what can we learn about transit. So let's move on to that, because again, it's a related concern, isn't it? So, well, if we all live in these, how are we all going to get around? I can't even get on the bus. The trains that don't work, etc. So, and you talk quite a lot about that. And the question specifically is kind of what lessons can we learn from international experience in terms of doing better on transit and traffic generally? You do talk about congestion charging, so I'd love to hear more about that. But just, you know, again, it's a it's a thing that progressives just, I'm in favor of transit, right? But then if you drill down, what do you mean by that? They mean specific and not other things. So what are we getting right and wrong about transit, and where can we learn from?
Yeah, so the United States has actually spent more on mass transit than I think most liberals realize or would like to acknowledge, because, you know, progressives, they like mass transit and they like spending money on things. So when they see that, you know, the U.S. is very low transit ridership, they would like to blame a lack of spending. You know, one just like weird fact in the book is the whole city of Dallas has a 4-line light rail system that has fewer riders than the single line tram in Turin, Italy. Now, so some of that, right? It's like, European cities are denser than American cities, but Dallas is a lot bigger than Turin. It's a much more extensive rail system. Nobody rides it because we don't have land use near the stations that allows for the construction. Because it's like, why would you take mass transit anywhere, right? Like,
if you have to drive a mile to the transit, the whole point is if you can't walk to it, it loses most of its appeal. So that's what the California bill was going to do, right? It's density around transit.
Right. And so Los Angeles has built a pretty big subway system, but they didn't change the zoning near the stations, right? So everybody's idea in American transit is like somebody else should take the train so I can keep driving.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to change anything about how the roads work.
Where are all these people going? Why are they all on the road? Is what we say as we drive to work. Yeah.
And so that doesn't work. There's also operational things. If you want to, the first draft of the book went into excruciating detail about commuter rail in the United States. But most Americans are aware that we are a laggard in terms of mass transit. But we are very resistant to doing the sort of obvious thing when you are a laggard, which is bring some foreigners in, right? Mm-hmm. When they tried it in New York briefly, they had a MTA head who had worked in London and Toronto, and it worked very well. And people kept saying like, oh, he's made the subway a lot better. And then he got fired due to personality clashes with the governor, which is unfortunate. But the basic logic that, Paris, Berlin, London, even much smaller European cities like Milan, Munich have just much better transit operations. And then in Asia, it's like, so light years ahead. I don't even know if we can talk to those people. But bring some people in from countries where the operations work better and they know what to do.
So they would get in under your merit-based system, if not Tom Cotton's one. But talk about congestion pricing, because that's it's obviously a difficult political one, and that's been asked by a couple of people as well. I can see. I mean, it's just charging Americans to drive around their own city in their own car.
Disaster.
Talk me through the politics of it.
Well, so look, 90% of the book is like, you think this problem is going to happen if the population grows, but you're wrong. Traffic jams is the exception to that. Like, it is factually true that if we had more people, there would be more traffic jams. And so I argue that we should address traffic jams the way several Asian and European cities do, the way, nerdy economists say you should. And that's charging people to use the roads at peak times. The politics of it are difficult. I mean, they're difficult in the United States, but as far as I can tell, they've been difficult everywhere it's been tried. This has always been an idea that technicians think is good and the electorate is very skeptical of. But what's telling to me is that it has tended not to be reversed, right? So lots of...
I was going to give you the example of London, actually.
Right.
On both fronts. One is like, all the politics, you can't possibly do that. And then Ken Livingstone just woke up one morning and did it, right? And everyone says he's going to kill for it politically, and he just did it. He just decided, I'm going to do it, right? And then Boris Johnson becomes mayor after him, and guess what? He keeps it, right? Because the infrastructure's in place, the revenue stream's in place, and so all the conservatives who are kind of freaking out about it, and Livingston just did it. So it takes, I think de Blasio is on record as saying, well, the politics just wouldn't work in New York, wouldn't work in America. Well, that was true in London until Ken Livingstone said, screw the politics, I'm just going to do it and change the politics.
Yeah, and it's telling in that regard, right? So, Stockholm, Oslo, this is very controversial, every place it's gone in, but there's no place where the new regime has gotten rid of it. And the reason is, I think, the revenue, right? So it's, if your congestion pricing scheme is already in place, then it is generating revenue. So if you were to get rid of congestion pricing, you would need to cut services or raise taxes. And cutting services is unpopular. Raising taxes is unpopular.
Yeah.
So why would you do an unpopular tax increase that also makes your traffic congestion worse? Right? Like it doesn't make any sense. And so, but on the flip side, it's like, no, I don't want to pay to drive around Washington any more than anybody else does. But if my property taxes got lower, right? Like that would be nice. And
if when you did drive, you could drive, faster than 6 miles per hour.
Well, and that's the thing, right? It's that nobody I don't want to pay any taxes. I don't want services to be cut. I don't want traffic jams. It's just like an impossible triad, right? But it's given that local governments are going to raise revenue. Like, why not raise revenue in ways that have significant co-benefits versus, a sales tax, right? Like, what is we have I think a 10% tax on restaurant meals here, and like, who does that help? Like that.
Yeah. So there's a question actually from Timothy Wojan, the National Science Foundation, worrying about climate change and emissions in particular. So let's talk about that. Partly in light of, I don't think you explicitly come out for a carbon tax, although certainly it's implicit, I think, in what you're talking about. But more, so there's the specific policy thing, which is why not a carbon tax? But secondly, isn't this the US, the statistic here that Timothy quotes is 4% of the population, currently 15% of carbon emissions. Hey, let's triple that. It's disaster for climate change. So I think you say, first of all, there's stuff we can do about climate change. You're not quite as perhaps as fearful about it as others, but more importantly, you don't seem to think this would be such a disaster for climate change as people could reasonably expect, given our current levels of emissions once you've tripled the population.
Well, there's a lot you could say about climate change. A main thing that I want to say is that the primary reason why emissions in the United States are so much larger than emissions in, say, Haiti, is that Haiti is very, very poor, and the United States is very wealthy. So, when people come here, like, global emissions does go up, and it goes up largely, though, because people are becoming wealthier. And I don't think you should think of climate as like an issue that exists distinct from all the other issues of the world, right? So you have ways of reducing carbon emissions that involve small offsetting sacrifices, and you have ways that involve large offsetting sacrifices. So I think that preventing people from moving to the United States is an incredibly high cost, climate strategy that doesn't make sense. Whereas like carbon taxes, I mean, this is exactly the same as congestion pricing, right? Like, the federal government raises all kinds of revenue. If we could raise revenue by taxing carbon emissions instead of other things, like, that would be really good, right? That's like a zero social cost, and we should definitely do that. If we spend money on, subsidizing clean energy projects, that's costly, but moderately costly, and has a high benefit. So, I mean, if I was to write a book about climate change, like, the book would say we should do things to reduce emissions that have modest or negative social costs, not things. Because look, I mean, like, we could drop a nuclear bomb on Chicago. That would reduce carbon emissions.
Or recessions turn out to be amazing.
Right. I mean, like, the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
So there's a strain of eco-doomism on the left that I think is converse of MAGA thought on the right, that is so concerned about ecological problems that it would sacrifice everything to their altar. And I don't want to do too much of a balance thing there, because it doesn't influence actual public policy in the same way, right? It's like Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. There's no like eco-doom wing of real politics. But when you get into intellectual circles, you go on NPR call-in shows and, talk at bookstores, you do hear from a lot of people who are like, well, we need to stop economic development in the third world. And like, that doesn't seem like a good idea to me at all.
Yeah. A lot more questions actually on climate change, but I think you've really covered that. The other area I do want to get into is decentralization, because it relates to the density point. And you talk about decentralizing government, decentralizing business, and you're then using immigration policy to have kind of American renewal visas in certain places. So you come in, but you live for 5 years in a place that most needs the injection of energy that you get from immigration. Let's just focus on the first two. So you were excited when the Trump administration said they were going to start moving agencies, including USDA, and then you say it was a disaster. So that seems to be more a question of how rather than what. But in principle, is that true? That you think that?
Yeah, I mean, I
executed politically executed in a horrific way, but if they'd done it better, it would have been a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talk about tripling the population, and you could do it entirely through sort of anti-NIMBY stuff, right? And, Metro New York becomes bigger than Tokyo, and so does like 4 other coastal cities. I think realistically, we should try to drive some population growth to the parts of the country that have been experiencing population decline. And one good lever for that is this idea of trying to sort of move government agencies and public sector stuff out of what's become a very expensive but very affluent metro area here in Greater Washington. Now, of course, I wrote this before COVID, before everybody does everything on Zoom.
Right.
So I think to an extent, we're all thinking a little bit more uncertainly about what the actual future of the relationship between where people live and where they work is. Conceivably, the long-term future now of a lot of rank and file public sector work is people will do it remotely, that is not what my book says. Instead, I assume people will continue to commute to offices and say we should think about relocating those jobs. I think Trump did it well. Trump is not a very thoughtful public policy person in general.
You think? I think you're allowed to say that, even though we're nonpartisan.
He has a lot of politicians in the United States, though, of whom Trump is one, but not unique, want to drive polarization.
Yeah.
So they want to come up with ideas that will be rejected by their opponents. And that I just think is a bad trend, right? And so he essentially did agency relocation in that spirit, right? And kind of welcomed people complaining about it, because then he gets to triangulate.
Because they want to own the libs. I would say the same about the SALT deduction, actually, which I've written about. And just think, I think it was good policy, actually, but it was done for such obviously naked political reasons that it was like the Dems are going to hate this in the blue cities and states. And sure enough, they do.
Right. It's like, oh, let's make them squeal. And then we can, and that's, I mean,
and vice versa, presumably, right? It's true both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of progressives, a big theme of this, right? This book is trying to connect some ideas that I have learned in the past 10 years, mostly circulating in left of center policy circles, and connect them to some values and themes that I think are important to conservative people in the United States of America. A lot of people just don't want to do that, right? Like they want to fight. And, my colleague and good friend, Ezra Klein, his book is Why We're Polarized. And he looks at the big kind of structural factors behind that. And to me, this is a book that's like, how could we transcend that? And why would we? Right?
Yeah.
An international challenge is traditionally a reason for partisans to try to think beyond partisan politics. And if you're doing that, it's like, well, how could we think about that? And trying to take the problems of Midwestern cities seriously as actual topics for concern, and not just as kind of like things we can yell about. Is one of the ideas in the book. And so one idea is we could let cities sponsor immigrants the way we let companies sponsor immigrants. We could move agencies. We could encourage companies, right? We could say quietly to Jeff Bezos, like, you might get a little more slack on some of your regulatory questions if your company was seen as benefiting a broad constituency of people. Maybe you should talk to some of the guys who handle the defense contracts and make sure that, I don't know what you see these ads in the subway, and it's like the Joint Strike Fighter is manufactured in 47 different states.
And you kind of think, who are they selling that to? Because I'm not buying a Joint Strike Fighter. I don't think I am. But do you take credit cards?
I wish I want to take the technology and finance executives on a tour of those metro ads from the defense contractors and be like, maybe do the politics this way, like it's ultimately healthier for the country to spread the wealth around a little bit.
Let me ask you one more question before my closing question, which is from this is a question from it's an unfair question because you don't write about it, but from Sherry Lind about the older population. Now, obviously, that's not your focus here, but to the extent that this is at the beginning, I talked about this as kind of in a way a youthful agenda. And there's the old joke about you're middle-aged when your broad mind and narrow waist have swapped places. And there's some truth into that which is older population are more culturally conservative, whiter, etc. least likely to be on board perhaps with this kind of agenda. And so what would you say if you were trying to arguing with, you know, an advocacy group for older Americans as to what's in this for them specifically? Because on the face of it, this feels like a more exciting agenda for a kind of urban 30-year-old than for a kind of, you know, semi-rural 60-year-old. So what would you say to them?
Well, you know, there's a deep and profound interconnections between urban and rural areas, between younger people and older people. I mean, ultimately, if you sort of peel past the vein of financing, right? Like the reason people can retire in good living standards is that there are other people who are working. The reason your assets that you save while you're working can be worth something when you retire is that there's younger people who want to purchase them. And so having growth is important, I think, to older Americans' well-being over the kind of longer haul. And I also, you know, older people can be more culturally conservative in a lot of ways, but are also people who actually remember a time when American society was more dynamic than it is. And, you know, I think it's always worth asking people, what are we nostalgic for when we think back to the situation that prevailed in the 1950s and 1960s? Because it was a past time and it was a different America, but it was actually a faster changing America, right? Living standards were rising more rapidly back then, which was great, but that meant things were changing very rapidly. The built environment in particular was changing constantly, because that's what it means actually to live in a prosperous, growing, egalitarian society, is that a lot of stuff changes. And what we have been locked into is a sort of perverse view in which people are very unhappy with the status quo, but then also very resistant to change. Right.
Yeah.
And like something that doesn't work. Right. If what you saw, I mean, COVID is its own thing, but, you know, going back before that, you didn't hear a lot of people embracing a kind of politics of complacency, but there was incredible resistance to change. Right. And my whole project here is like, I want people to get back in touch with like, how could things be better? And to be better, they have to be different.
Yes, and I think tapping into that, like the kind of bring backery that we talk about, and that was actually the last thing I wanted to invite you to reflect a bit personally on, because in some ways I would say this book is going against a lot of currents. It is forward-looking in an era that's quite nostalgic. It is optimistic when you can see rising levels of pessimism among many people. It's seeking bipartisan opportunities to do deals in an era that's kind of much more polarized. So it has a very different feel to it. In some ways, it has an older American feel to it right now. So if all of that's true, and if I'm right that to some extent it is kind of against some of what's in the atmosphere right now, how did you get to that place, right? And it's also big ideas, not incremental. So it's like, and what sustains you in terms of that position? And are you hopeful that you're sort of trying, and if so, why, right? As you look forward, because I can imagine you could think well about the next 4 to 8 years, or you could just think like, more of the same from both sides. Everyone's competing about different versions of the past. And we've lost that future orientation that I think is at the heart of it. But what gives you hope about that?
You know, I think hope is on some level a kind of an existential choice rather than an analytical one. I don't think there's any point in living a life that is based on telling people things won't work. You know, I have a whole other guise in which more radical people are yelling at me all the time because I say it's important to sort of pursue and accept incremental change. But I always I'm a huge fan of Max Weber and Politics as a Vocation. And he says, you know, we would not have achieved anything unless we dreamed of the impossible. And yet, like, you need to recognize what's possible and say yes to it. So I think, you know, in my role as a writer and as a public figure and as someone who is not a practitioner of bare-knuckled electoral politics, my responsibility is to try to paint vistas for the world that I hope will be appealing to people and will kind of catch on with them. I've always loved, as I know a lot of people interested in politics are, I always loved Star Trek and that sort of mid-century American liberalism that was very optimistic and forward-looking and not naive about the realities of the United States of America, but believing in the values and principles and the possibility of change and transformation and betterment. So, I look at the disasters that are surrounding us currently, and it makes me sad. And yet, in a spirit of optimism, we have seen breakthroughs on a pharmacological level that are unprecedented in their speed, and not all done in the United States, but much of it in the United States and the UK, which are two of the countries that have done worst with the social management aspect of this, have done well on the technological aspect. And we're here doing this on Zoom. Lots of white collar workers all over the world are taking advantage of digital tools, largely developed in the United States, often developed by companies that are founded by immigrants, and things that were dismissed, I think, 12, 18 months ago as like toys or useless. We're now actually seeing the power of that Silicon Valley technology to address big issues, right? And I am hopeful that, when we get beyond this, hopefully we will have learned something about how to organize a crash program to address urgent public health needs with pharmaceutical development, how to use digital technology to transcend some of the problems about traffic jams and housing scarcity and the spatial distribution of opportunity. So America is actually quite good at engineering problems, and bad at certain other aspects of governance. But as a hopeful person, I see this as an area that we've actually made a lot of progress under times of strain. And I want people to take the risks to our geopolitical standing a little bit more seriously, because it's something that is in the air, but not really been the focus of our politics. But I do think that the problems, right, when people talk about, well, why this can't work, it winds up alighting so heavily on questions about traffic jams and where will the apartment buildings go. But these are very solvable problems, right? If we decide that actually we want to be number one, we can address the other issues.
If we set that goal, that long run goal, then can do that. So we're at time, and I will say that if you're looking, if I was blurbing your book now, Matt, I think I'd say you are one of the least fashionable, most needed public figures, a true optimist.
Well, that's very kind.
So everyone should definitely read this book. There's plenty in it to argue with, plenty with it to agree with. Certainly it's a manifesto for optimism. And I would say that your time will be much better spent reading this book and thinking about its implications than looking at your Twitter feed or tuning into the latest news. The long-termism inherent in it, the openness that's inherent. This is, to go back to kind of Popper's language that Tony Blair used, the big difference is no longer between left and right, it's between open and closed. And I think this is an engine for openness and optimism and a kind of a spirit of the future, which can then, as you say, turn into discussions about specific land use regulations. But the beating heart of the book is that future orientation and optimism. And I thoroughly commend it to everybody. And I just want to thank you again on behalf of Brookings for not only this book, but your work in this space. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in. Take care.